The first light of
You
morning
knew this
crept
was
over the
coming.
rooftops of
I don't want any
Ridgewood,
trouble.
Montana like a
Too
slow
late for that.
confession. It came through the gaps between old brick buildings stretching long golden fingers across cracked sidewalks and rusted mailboxes. The air was sharp with the bite of early autumn, the kind of cold that reminded you winter was already sharpening its teeth somewhere just beyond the mountains. And on the corner of Maple Street and Fifth, wedged between a barber shop that had not changed its prices since 1987 and a hardware store that still kept a bell above the door, sat a diner. The Maple Street Diner was not the kind of place that ended up in travel magazines or food blogs. It did not serve avocado toast or pour coffee into mugs shaped like animals. What it served was honest, eggs cooked the way you asked, bacon that cracked when you bit into it, toast with real butter, coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead and bitter enough to remind you that you were still alive. The linoleum floor had been mopped so many times the pattern had worn away in front of the counter, leaving a smooth, pale trail where thousands of boots and sneakers and dress shoes had stood over the decades. The booths were upholstered in red vinyl that had faded to a color somewhere between rust and memory. And every morning at exactly 6 o'clock, the lights inside flickered on, and a woman unlocked the front door and stepped into the quiet. Her name was Colleen Mercer, and she had owned the Maple Street Diner for 25 years. She was 58 years old, though the lines around her eyes and the silver threading through her auburn hair made her look like she had lived several lifetimes stacked one on top of the other. She was not a tall woman, but she carried herself with the kind of straightness that made people think she was. Her hands were rough from years of scrubbing grills and hauling boxes of supplies from the back of delivery trucks. Her voice was steady, never loud, but it had a quality to it that made people listen when she spoke. She had the kind of face that did not ask for sympathy and the kind of eyes that gave it freely. 25 years she had poured into this place. 25 years of 5:30 alarms, of flour-dusted aprons of coffee urns that needed replacing, and freezers that broke on the hottest days of summer. She had started the diner with her husband Frank back when they were young and foolish enough to think that love and hard work were the same thing. Frank had been a carpenter by trade, and he had built the counter himself, a long stretch of oak that he sanded by hand until it was smooth as riverstone. He had hung the shelves, installed the lighting, even welded the legs of the stools at the counter, because the ones they could afford kept wobbling. Frank had been gone for 6 years now. Heart attack. Quick and without warning, the way he had always said he wanted to go, though. Colleen was certain he had been joking at the time. She found him on the kitchen floor of their small house, 3 blocks from the diner, still wearing his boots and a cup of coffee half finished on the counter above him. The paramedics said he was likely gone before he hit the ground. Colleen had nodded at that as though it were useful information, and then she had gone to the diner the next morning at 6 o'clock and opened the doors as though the world had not just cracked in half. That was who Colleen was. Not because she did not feel the pain, but because she understood that some things keep going whether you are ready or not. The diner kept going. The customers kept coming. And Colleen kept pouring coffee because that was what she knew how to do, and because the alternative was to sit in an empty house and listen to the silence where Frank's voice used to be. She had no children of her own. She and Frank had tried for years, but it never happened. And eventually they stopped talking about it the way you stop mentioning a room in your house that you have locked and decided never to enter again. But Colleen had never been the kind of woman who needed a bloodline to build a family. Her family was the diner. Her family was the regulars who came in every morning and sat in the same seats and ordered the same meals and told her the same stories she had heard 100 times before. She knew their names, their birthdays, their grandchildren, their surgeries, their griefs. She remembered who took cream and who took sugar and who needed decaf but refused to admit it. And of all the regulars who walked through the door of the Maple Street Diner, none was more faithful than the old man who arrived every morning at exactly 8:15. His name was Emmett Hollis, and he was 81 years old. He came through the door the same way every day, slow but deliberate, his left hand gripping the handle of a wooden cane that had been carved by someone who cared about the work. His right hand would push the door open with a firmness that surprised people who only saw his age and not the man beneath it. He wore flannel shirts, always buttoned to the second from top button, tucked into dark trousers, held up by suspenders, that he had owned longer than most of the other customers had been alive. His boots were heavy and well-worn, the kind of boots that had walked through mud and snow and gravel and come out the other side still holding together. His face was weathered the way good leather is weathered, creased and sun-darkened, with deep lines that ran from the corners of his eyes to his jaw like riverbeds, carved by decades of wind and worry and laughter. But it was his eyes that told you who he really was. They were pale blue, almost gray, and they held a steadiness that had nothing to do with stubbornness and everything to do with having once stood in a place where fear was the only rational response and choosing to stand anyway. Emmett Hollis was a veteran of the Korean War. He had enlisted as a young man during the Korean War, shipping out before he was old enough to understand what war truly meant, and coming home with a piece of shrapnel in his left thigh, that the surgeons decided was safer to leave in than to take out, and a silence in his chest that he carried for the rest of his life like a stone he could not put down. He never talked about the war, not to his wife, not to his son, not to anyone. He simply lived with it the way you live with a scar, aware of it, always touching it, sometimes in the dark, but never showing it to the world unless the world asked very specifically and very gently. Every morning he walked into the Maple Street diner and sat in the corner booth, the one closest to the window, where the sunlight came in at an angle that warmed the table, but did not hit his eyes. Colleen always had his coffee ready by the time he sat down. Black, no sugar, in the white ceramic mug with a small chip on the handle that he had claimed as his own years ago. She would set it down in front of him and say the same thing she always said. "Morning, Mr. Hollis." And he would nod and say the same thing he always said. "Morning, Colleen." That was their ritual. It was small and ordinary, but it was also sacred in the way that small, ordinary things become sacred when they are repeated enough times by people who mean them. To Colleen, Emmett was more than a customer. He was the closest thing she had to a father. Her own parents had passed years ago, and Frank's parents before that. Emmett had filled that space without either of them ever naming it. He was the man she called when the furnace broke, and she did not know which valve to turn. He was the man who sat at the counter on the anniversary of Frank's death and said nothing because he understood that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a grieving person is simply to be present. And to Emmett, Colleen was something he could not quite put into words. She reminded him of someone, not in appearance but in spirit. She reminded him of his wife, Lorraine Hollis. Rainey, he had called her, because when they first met at a church picnic in 1964, it had been raining, and she had been the only person there who was laughing about it. She had dark hair and a smile that made you feel like you had just been forgiven for something you had not confessed yet. She was kind in a way that was not soft, strong, in a way that was not hard. She could silence a room with a look and fill it with warmth with a word. She had been the center of Emmett's universe for 56 years, and when she died 3 years ago, quietly in her sleep with Emmett holding her hand in the hospital bed, they had moved into the living room so she could see the garden. He had felt the axis of his world tilt and never quite straighten again. Rainey and Colleen had been close. Not just friends, but the kind of women who understood each other the way sisters do, with a shorthand that did not require explanation. Rainey had been a regular at the diner long before she got sick, and when the cancer came, Colleen had driven meals to the house 3 times a week, sitting with Rainey on the porch while Emmett pretended to fix things in the garage so they could have their time together. It was Rainey who had told Colleen the secret, not all at once. It came out slowly over the course of several visits in those final months when Rainey's body was fading, but her mind was still sharp as the blade. She told Colleen about their son, about Rowan Hollis, born 1969, the only child Emmett and Rainey ever had, and the one wound that neither of them could heal. Rowan had been a difficult boy, not mean, not cruel, but restless in a way that made Emmett uneasy. He had too much energy, too much anger, too many questions that Emmett did not know how to answer because he had been raised in a generation where men did not answer questions about their feelings. They endured them. Rowan had grown up watching his father sit in silence, watching him stare out windows, watching him flinch at loud noises and grip the arms of his chair during thunderstorms, and he had drawn the only conclusion a child could draw. He decided his father did not love him. It was not true. Emmett loved Rowan with a ferocity that terrified him because he did not know how to express it without also expressing the fear that came with it, the fear that the world would break his son the way it had broken him. So he became strict, disciplined. He set rules and curfews and expectations that felt to a young man burning with the need to be free like walls closing in. By the time Rowan was 20, he had found the motorcycle club. By 25, he was riding with the Hells Angels, and the distance between father and son had become a canyon neither of them knew how to cross. Emmett saw the leather vest and the tattoos and the roaring engines and thought his son had thrown his life away. Rowan saw his father's disapproval and thought it was the only honest thing the old man had ever shown him. Then came the night that shattered everything. Rowan was 33 years old. He had been drinking at a bar outside of town, and he got on his bike when he should have called someone. He ran a red light at the intersection of Route 12 and Garrison Road and clipped a pickup truck driven by a 17-year-old boy named Danny Ferris. Danny survived, but his right leg was crushed and the medical bills were more than his family could afford. The police arrested Rowan. The charges were severe. He was looking at years in prison. Emmett did not hesitate. He went to the Ferris family himself. He sat in their living room, a man in his 60s with shaking hands in a voice that cracked only once, and he told them that he would pay every cent of their son's medical bills, every surgery, every session of physical therapy, every dollar. He did not make excuses for Rowan. He did not ask for sympathy. He simply said that he was a father and that he was asking them as parents to let him make this right. The Ferris family agreed. The charges were reduced, then dropped as part of a civil settlement. Rowan walked free, but the cost was everything Emmett had, his pension, his savings, the small inheritance Rainey's mother had left them, all of it gone. Emmett never told Rowan what he had done. He never told him about the money, about the meetings with the Ferris family, about the months of payments that stretched on long after Rowan had left town. What Emmett told Rowan, in the only way he knew how, was that he needed to change, that the motorcycle club was destroying him, that if he kept down this road, it would end in a place no father wanted to see his son go. Rowan heard what he always heard: judgment, disapproval, shame. They argued. It was the worst fight they ever had. Words were said that could not be taken back, the kind of words that burn through the air and leave scars on the silence that follows. Rowan packed a bag that night and rode out of Ridgewood on his Harley, and he did not come back. That was 22 years ago. Emmett never spoke of it. Not to the neighbors, not to his friends at the VFW, not even to Rainey in the years that followed, though she knew. Of course she knew. She was his wife. She could read the grief on his face the way you read weather on the horizon. She watched him write letters at the kitchen table late at night, letters addressed to post office boxes and motorcycle clubhouses, and forwarding addresses that changed every few months. He wrote hundreds of them over the years, each one beginning the same way and ending the same way. He never sent a single one. Rainey told Colleen all of this in the final weeks. She told her about the money, about the sacrifice, about the letters. And then she asked Colleen to do something that Colleen had carried with her ever since. If anything ever happens to Emmett, Rainey said, her voice thin but certain, you find Rowan, you tell him the truth, because Emmett never will. He is too proud and he is too afraid. But that boy deserves to know that his father never stopped loving him. Not for one single day. Colleen had promised. And for 3 years, she had kept that promise tucked away like a letter of her own, waiting for the moment when it would need to be opened. She did not know that the moment was coming that very morning. It was a Tuesday. October. The leaves on the maple trees that lined the street outside the diner had turned the color of rust and honey, and they drifted down in slow spirals whenever the wind remembered to blow. The sky was the pale gray of an old photograph, and the air smelled like wood smoke in the first frost. Colleen had opened the diner at 6 as always. By 7, the morning regulars had begun to filter in. There was Earl Newsom, 74 retired postman, who sat at the counter and read the newspaper from back to front, because he said the sports section was the only honest part. There was Dorothy Bledsoe, 69, who came in for toast and tea and always left exact change plus a quarter. There was Hank Purcell, who ran the hardware store next door and came in for coffee before opening up, and who always complained about the coffee as though it were a form of greeting. By 8:15, Emmett walked in, same as always, same booth, same coffee, same quiet nod to Colleen. He sat down and placed his hands flat on the table the way he always did, as though steadying himself against something only he could feel. Colleen brought his coffee without being asked and set it down in front of him. "Morning, Mr. Hollis." "Morning, Colleen." She lingered a moment longer than usual. She had noticed something in the past few weeks, a slowness in his step that was different from the usual caution of age, a grayness under his eyes that had not been there before. She wanted to ask if he was all right, but she knew him well enough to know that he would say he was fine, and she knew herself well enough to know that she would worry anyway. The morning moved on. The diner filled with the comfortable noise of forks on plates and low conversation and the sizzle of bacon on the grill. Colleen moved behind the counter with the efficiency of a woman who had done this 10,000 times, refilling cups and clearing plates and exchanging small kindnesses with people she had known for years. Then the door opened and the temperature in the room changed. Two men walked in. The first was tall and broad with a neck like a fence post and hands that looked like they had been made for breaking things rather than building them. He wore a black jacket over a gray hoodie and his head was shaved close to the skin. His eyes were small and hard and set too close together, giving him the look of someone who was always calculating whether a situation was worth his trouble. His name was Cade Strickland, and he was 32 years old, and he had not come to the Maple Street Diner for breakfast. The second man was shorter, thinner, with a nervous energy that made him seem like he was vibrating even when he was standing still. He stayed a step behind Cade the way a shadow stays behind the thing that cast it. Colleen recognized Cade. He had been in twice before, always with the same routine. He would order coffee, sit at the counter, and then when the diner was at its quietest, he would lean over and have a conversation with Colleen that was not really a conversation at all. It was a proposition, a business arrangement, a monthly fee for what he called protection, which was the kind of word that meant the opposite of itself when spoken by a man like Cade Strickland. Colleen had refused both times, politely the first time, firmly the second. She had told him that the Maple Street Diner had been standing on this corner for 25 years without anyone's protection, and it would stand for 25 more. Cade had smiled both times. The kind of smile that a man gives when he has already decided what he is going to do and is simply waiting for the right moment to do it. This was the third time. He walked in and did not sit down. He stood near the counter, his presence filling the room, the way smoke fills a room slowly and then all at once. The shorter man stood by the door, blocking it, not with his body, but with the implication of his body. The regulars noticed. Earl put down his newspaper. Dorothy set her teacup in its saucer with exaggerated care. Hank stopped mid-sentence and looked at Colleen, and in his eyes she saw the question he did not ask. Cade placed both hands on the counter and leaned forward. His voice was low, but in the sudden silence of the diner, it carried like a stone thrown into still water. I'm going to keep this simple, Colleen. You owe me $1,500 a month. You've missed 3 months. That's $4,500 you're sitting on. I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to collect. Colleen stood behind the counter and met his gaze. She did not step back. She did not look down. She held a coffee pot in her right hand, and her grip on the handle was the only thing that betrayed the adrenaline coursing through her body. I don't owe you anything, Cade. I've told you that before, and I'll tell you again. This is my place. I built it with my husband. No one collects from me. Cade tilted his head slightly, the way a dog does when it hears a sound it does not understand. Your husband's dead, Colleen. Who's going to back you up? These people. He gestured at the room with a sweep of his hand, taking in the elderly customers, the worn booths, the faded linoleum. Look around. This whole block is full of old folks running shops that should have closed 10 years ago. Times change, and people who don't change with them get left behind. He reached across the counter and swept a row of coffee mugs onto the floor. The crash was sharp and sudden, and Dorothy let out a small cry. Earl stood up from his stool, but Cade fixed him with a look that made the old postman sit back down. $4,500 by Friday, or I start making adjustments to the decor. The diner was silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The fear in the room was almost physical, a weight pressing down on every chest, a hand closing around every throat. These were not people who were built for confrontation. They were retirees and widows and small business owners who had spent their lives being decent and expected decency in return. They did not know what to do when decency was not part of the equation. And then a voice came from the corner booth. That's enough. It was not loud. It was not angry. It was simply certain, the way a nail is certain when it has been driven all the way into the wood. Every head in the diner turned toward the sound. Emmett Hollis was standing. He had pushed himself up from the booth with both hands on the table, his cane hooked over the edge of the seat. He stood at his full height, which was not what it once had been, but was still enough to matter. His shoulders, though stooped, were set, His jaw was firm, and his eyes, those pale blue-gray eyes that had once watched enemy soldiers cross a frozen river in Korea, were fixed on Cade Strickland with a clarity that cut through the room like a blade. "This woman told you no," Emmett said. "That means no. You don't come into someone's place of business and make threats. Not in this town, not in this diner, not while I'm sitting here." The room held its breath. Cade turned slowly. He looked at Emmett the way a wolf looks at something that is too old and too slow to be a threat, but has made the mistake of stepping into its path anyway. "Sit down, old man. This doesn't concern you." "Everything that happens in this diner concerns me," Emmett said. "I've been eating breakfast here since before you were born, and I've seen men like you before. I've seen them in places a lot worse than this, and I can tell you something about every single one of them." He took a step forward, just one, but it was enough. "They all think they're the toughest man in the room, right up until the moment they find out they're not." Something shifted in Cade's face. It was not fear, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that could become fear if given enough time and the right conditions. But Cade Strickland had spent his entire adult life making sure that feeling never took root. He had learned in the streets, in alleys, in parking lots, where he had built his small empire of intimidation, that the fastest way to kill fear was to turn it into anger, and anger was something he understood very well. He crossed the diner in 4 strides. The slap was sudden and vicious. Not a punch, but an open-handed strike delivered with the full rotation of Cade's shoulder, the sound of it cracking through the diner like a branch snapping in a storm. It connected with the left side of Emmett's face, and the old man's head turned sharply, his body rocking backward. His cane clattered to the floor. His hand shot out and gripped the edge of the booth, and that grip was the only thing that kept him on his feet. The diner erupted in gasps. Dorothy covered her mouth with both hands. Earl half rose from his stool again, his face white. The cook, a quiet man named Gus, who had worked the grill for 12 years, appeared in the kitchen doorway with wide eyes and a spatula still in his hand. But Emmett did not fall. He stood there, one hand on the booth, the other rising slowly to his face. His cheek was already reddening, the print of Cade's hand emerging like a brand. His lip was split, and a thin line of blood traced down his chin. His eyes watered from the impact, but he did not cry out. He did not stumble. He stood and he breathed, and he kept his gaze fixed forward, not on Cade, but on some middle distance that only he could see, as though he were standing not in a diner in Montana, but somewhere else entirely. Somewhere cold and far away, where he had learned a long time ago that pain was not the thing that broke a man. Surrender was. Colleen saw it happen as though the world had slowed to half its speed. She saw Cade's arms swing. She saw Emmett's head snap sideways. She saw the blood on his lip and the shock on his face, and something inside her. Something that had been coiled tight for years, for decades, since Frank died and left her alone to hold up the walls of her life with nothing but her bare hands. That something came undone. She did not scream. She did not freeze. She came around the counter faster than anyone in the diner expected a woman her age to move, and she put herself directly between Emmett and Cade. Not beside Emmett, not behind him, between them. Her body was a wall. Her eyes were locked on Cade's, and in them there was something that Cade had not seen in a very long time. Absolute refusal. "You do not touch him." Her voice was low and even, and carried the weight of a woman who had buried a husband, run a business alone, and survived every single thing the world had thrown at her without once asking for help she did not earn. "You do not touch anyone in my diner. You turn around. You walk out that door, and you do not come back." Cade stared at her. His hand was still open at his side, the palm still stinging from the contact. He was a full head taller than Colleen and outweighed her by at least 100 pounds, and yet something in the way she stood there, unflinching, unmoving, made him hesitate. It was not physical intimidation. It was something else, something he did not have a word for. The moment stretched. The diner was so quiet you could hear the coffee maker dripping behind the counter. Then Cade smiled. It was a slow, ugly smile, the kind that promises nothing good. "Friday, Colleen," he said, 4,500, and next time tell your guard dog to keep his mouth shut." He turned and walked out. His companion followed. The door swung shut behind them, and the bell above it jingled a cheerful sound that felt obscene in the context of what had just happened. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Then slowly sound returned. Dorothy began to cry softly. Earl sat down heavily and put his face in his hands. Gus retreated to the kitchen and turned the grill off because his hands were shaking too much to cook. Colleen turned to Emmett. He was still standing still holding the booth, his face a mask of controlled pain. She reached for his arm and guided him gently back into the seat. She picked up his cane and leaned it against the table. She took a clean napkin from the dispenser and pressed it to his lip with a tenderness that made the old man close his eyes. "I'm all right," he said. "You're bleeding, Mr. Hollis." "I've bled before." She sat down across from him. Not because she needed to rest, but because she needed to be close to him, to let him know that he was not alone, that what he had done mattered, that his courage had not been wasted, even if it had cost him blood. They sat together in that booth for a long time. The other customers slowly gathered themselves. Some left unable to stay in the space where the violence had happened. Others stayed unsure of where else to go. Earl brought Colleen a glass of water without being asked and set it on the table without a word. And as Colleen sat there watching Emmett dab the blood from his lip with the patience of a man who had been wounded in far worse ways, something crystallized inside her. It was not a thought so much as a decision, and it arrived fully formed the way the most important decisions often do. She was not going to pay. She was not going to let Cade Strickland take her diner or hurt Emmett Hollis or terrorize the people on this street who had done nothing wrong except grow old in a town that was changing faster than they could keep up with. She was going to fight. In the hours after Cade left, Colleen locked the diner early for the first time in 25 years. She flipped the sign to close, turned off the lights in the dining room, and sat in the back office with the door shut. It was a small room, barely big enough for a desk and a filing cabinet, with a calendar on the wall that still showed last month's page, and a photograph of Frank tacked to the corkboard above the desk. She stared at that photograph for a long time. Frank in his workshop, sawdust in his hair, grinning at the camera like a man who had never considered the possibility that the world might not be kind. What would you do, she thought. But she already knew the answer. Frank would have grabbed a baseball bat and gone looking for Cade Strickland, and he would have ended up in the hospital or in jail or both, because Frank had been brave and good and absolutely terrible at knowing when courage was not enough. Colleen was not Frank. She did not have his strength or his recklessness, but she had something else. She had patience. She had attention to detail. And she had spent 25 years running a business in a small town, which meant she knew every person on this street, every story behind every shop, every grudge and every favor and every connection that held this community together like stitches in a quilt. She picked up the phone and started making calls. The first was to Pearl Hoffman, 75, who ran a flower kiosk 3 doors down. Pearl answered on the second ring, and before Colleen could say a word, Pearl said, "I heard what happened, Colleen. Dorothy called me. Is Mr. Hollis all right?" "He'll be fine. Pearl, I need to ask you something. Has Cade Strickland come to see you?" The silence on the other end was answer enough. "How much?" Colleen asked. "1,000 a month. I've been paying it for 4 months because I didn't know what else to do. Colleen, I'm 75 years old. I sell flowers. Where am I supposed to find $1,000 a month?" Colleen called 6 more people that afternoon. Every call was the same, and every call broke her heart a little more. There was Arthur Sheehan, the tailor, 71, who had been hemming trousers and altering suits on Maple Street for 38 years. His hands shook now when he threaded a needle, but his stitches were still the straightest in town. He told Colleen he had been paying Cade $800 a month for 5 months, taking the money from the savings account he and his late wife had set aside for their grandson's college fund. There was June Prescott, who ran the used bookshop 2 doors past the barbershop. June was 68 and had opened the store after retiring from teaching because she could not imagine a life without books in it. She told Colleen she had been paying $700 a month and had already missed her car insurance payment twice. She was afraid to tell her daughter because her daughter would make her close the shop and move to Portland, and June would rather lose everything than leave the town where she had lived for 40 years. There was Vernon Burke, the watch repairman, 73, who worked out of a shop so small you could stand in the middle and touch both walls. Vernon had served in Vietnam and walked with a limp from a wound he never discussed. He had not paid Cade a single dollar. He had simply locked his door when Cade came and refused to open it. But last week, someone had thrown a brick through his front window at 3 in the morning, And Vernon had spent $200, he did not have to replace it, and he had not slept a full night since. And there was Martha Haddock, who ran the small bakery at the end of the block. Martha was 70 and had learned to bake from her grandmother, and the smell of her sourdough bread was one of the things that made Maple Street feel like a place where people still cared about doing things the right way. Martha had been paying $1,000 a month, and she told Colleen through tears that she had taken out a loan against her house to cover it, and if she missed another payment, the bank would start asking questions she could not answer. Each one had been given the same speech about protection, the same veiled threats, the same impossible demands. None of them had told anyone because Kate had made it clear what happened to people who talked. They had each suffered in silence alone, she believing they were the only ones. By the time Colleen hung up the last call, the picture was clear. This was not a random shakedown. This was systematic. Cade Strickland had identified the most vulnerable block in Ridgewood and was bleeding it dry one frightened old person at a time. Colleen sat at her desk and felt the anger settle into her bones like heat from a fire. It was not the hot, explosive anger that made people do stupid things. It was the slow, deep kind. The kind that burns for weeks and months and years if it has to. The kind that builds plans instead of breaking things. She went to see Emmett that evening. He lived alone in the small house on Birch Lane that he and Rainey had shared for 50 years. The garden Rainey had kept was overgrown now, the roses climbing wild over the fence, their thorns catching on the wooden slats like fingers trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. The porch light was on, casting a yellow glow over the steps where Rainey used to sit in the evenings, with a glass of iced tea, watching the sun go down behind the mountains. Emmett had not changed anything inside the house since she died. Her reading glasses were still on the nightstand. Her coat still hung by the back door. Her favorite mug, the blue one with the chipped handle, still sat in the dish rack, as though she had just washed it and would be back any moment to fill it with chamomile tea. This was how Emmett mourned, not by letting go, but by holding on to every small thing, every trace of the woman who had made his life bearable in the years after the war, when the nightmares came and the silence inside him threatened to swallow everything whole. Rainey had been his anchor. Without her, he drifted, and the diner was the only place that still felt like solid ground. He answered the door with a bruise blooming purple across his left cheek and a cup of tea in his hand. He did not seem surprised to see her. There was a weariness in his face that went deeper than the bruise, deeper than the split lip that had scabbed over during the afternoon. It was the weariness of a man who had spent a lifetime standing up when the world told him to sit down, and who was beginning to wonder how many more times he could do it. "You're going to fight them," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." He nodded and stepped aside to let her in. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Emmett had written hundreds of letters to a son who never received them. Colleen told him what she had learned, about Pearl, about the tailor and the bookshop and the bakery, about the scope of what Cade Strickland was doing. Emmett listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that Colleen would carry with her through every difficult moment that was about to come. "You're choosing to fight a battle, Colleen. That's a brave thing. But I want you to understand something. The hardest part of any fight isn't the enemy in front of you. It's the moment when the people beside you start to walk away. When you look to your left and your right and there's no one there, that's when you find out what you're really made of." Colleen met his gaze. "Did that happen to you in Korea?" Emmett touched the bruise on his cheek gently, as though testing whether it was real. "It happens in every war," he said. "The question isn't whether it will happen. The question is whether you'll still be standing when it does." Colleen reached across the table and placed her hand over his. The old man's fingers were trembling slightly, but his grip was firm. "I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Hollis. I know you're not. That's why I'm worried." She left his house at 9 o'clock that night and walked back to the diner under a sky full of stars. The town was quiet. The street lights cast pools of amber on the sidewalks, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked twice and then went silent. As she walked, Colleen thought about Rainey, about the promise she had made, about Rowan Hollis out there somewhere in the world riding with the hellsangels, not knowing that his father had given up everything for him and never stopped writing letters that he never had the courage to send. She thought about calling Rowan. Not yet. Not for this. This was her fight, and she would not call in cavalry she did not need. But the thought was there lodged in the back of her mind like a splinter. When she reached the diner, she stopped on the sidewalk and looked at it. The dark windows, the faded sign, the counter Frank had built with his own hands. 25 years of her life were in that building. 25 years of early mornings and late nights and meals served with care to people who needed more than food. They needed to be seen. They needed to be known. They needed someone to remember their name and ask how they were doing and mean it when they asked. That was what Cade Strickland was trying to take. Not just money, not just property. He was trying to take the thing that kept these people whole. Colleen unlocked the door and stepped inside. The diner was dark and silent. She sat down at the counter on the stool that Frank used to sit on when he would stay late to keep her company while she closed up. She folded her hands on the oak surface he had sanded smooth with his own two palms, and she sat there in the dark and she made her plan. She would not run. She would not pay. She would not beg for help from men with badges who had never set foot on Maple Street and would not care about it until something terrible happened. She would do this herself, and it started tonight. Late that night, alone in the back office, Colleen pulled out a notebook. She began to write names, dates, amounts, everything Pearl had told her, everything the others had shared. She created a ledger of Cade Strickland's crimes written in her neat, careful handwriting, the same handwriting she used for the diner's daily specials board. She did not know yet how she would use it. She did not know yet what shape her resistance would take. But she knew with the certainty of a woman who had rebuilt her life from the ground up once before and was ready to do it again, that she would not stop until every person on Maple Street could walk into their shop in the morning without fear. She thought of Emmett's words, the moment when the people beside you start to walk away. She set her jaw and kept writing. She would deal with that moment when it came. And then almost as an afterthought, she opened her phone and scrolled to a number she had saved 3 years ago. A number Rainey had pressed into her hand in the hospital, scrawled on a torn piece of paper in handwriting that was barely legible. Rowan Hollis. She did not call. Not yet. But she stared at the number for a long time, her thumb hovering over the screen, feeling the weight of a promise she had made to a dying woman. Then she closed the phone, put it in her pocket, and went back to writing. Friday was 4 days away. She had work to do. But late that night, after the notebook was full, and the plan was forming, and the diner was locked tight, Colleen did one more thing. She picked up the phone. She dialed the number. It rang 4 times, and then a voice answered. A man's voice, rough and guarded, the voice of someone who did not receive calls from unknown numbers and expected nothing good from them. Who is this? My name is Colleen Mercer. I own the Maple Street Diner in Ridgewood. I was a friend of your mother's. Silence, long enough that Colleen thought he might hang up. What do you want? Your father was attacked today. A man came into my diner and struck him across the face. He's 81 years old, Rowan. He stood up to defend me, and he was hit for it. He's all right, but he's hurt. More silence. She could hear breathing on the other end, heavy and deliberate, the breathing of a man who was fighting to keep something inside from getting out. I'm not calling to ask you to come back, Colleen said. I'm not calling to guilt you into anything. I'm calling because your mother asked me to. Before she died, she made me promise that if anything ever happened to your father, I would find you. She said you deserve to know. She said Emmett would never call you himself because he's too proud and too afraid. But she wanted you to know that he never stopped thinking about you. Not for one single day. The silence that followed was the longest of all. Colleen listened to it the way you listen to a river hearing the current beneath the surface. Then, without a word, Rowan Hollis hung up. Colleen set the phone down on the counter. She stared at it for a moment. Then she exhaled long and slow and nodded to herself. She had kept her promise. Whatever came next was not in her hands. She turned off the lights, locked the door, and walked home through the cold October night, the leaves falling silently around her, the stars burning overhead like small, distant, unblinking fires. And somewhere hundreds of miles away, in a garage lit by a single bare bulb, a 55-year-old man sat on an overturned crate beside a Harley-Davidson that gleamed in the yellow light and held his phone in both hands and stared at the screen and did not move for a very long time. On the wall behind him hung an old photograph, creased and faded at the edges, of a young man in a military uniform, standing in front of a house with a garden full of roses. The young man was not smiling, but his eyes held something that might have been hope, or might have been love, or might have been the thing that exists in the space between the two. Rowan set the phone down. He pressed his palms against his eyes. And for the first time in 22 years, he let himself remember what it felt like to have a father. The garage was cold and the bulb above him flickered, once casting shadows that moved across the concrete floor like ghosts. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the sound of distant traffic and the low hum of a world that kept moving, whether you were ready for it or not. Rowan sat there motionless, his breathing the only sound in the room, and he thought about a house on Birch Lane with roses growing wild over the fence. He thought about a kitchen table and a man sitting at it, writing letters by lamplight. He thought about a woman named Colleen Mercer, who had the nerve to call a stranger in the middle of the night and tell him the truth his father had been too afraid to say. He thought about all of it, and he did not sleep that night, not a single hour, because some truths, once they enter, a man do not allow him rest until he decides what to do with them. The next morning, Colleen opened the diner at 6 o'clock, same as always. She had slept for 3 hours, maybe less, her mind turning over plans and possibilities, the way a river turns over stones, wearing them smooth, but never quite letting them settle. She had dark circles under her eyes and a stiffness in her shoulders that no amount of coffee would fix, but she moved through the kitchen with the same steady rhythm she always had, cracking eggs, lighting the grill, setting out the salt and pepper shakers on every table, as though the world had not tilted on its axis the day before. By 7, the regulars began to arrive. But the diner was different this morning, and everyone could feel it. The conversations were quieter. People glanced at the door more often. Dorothy Bledsoe came in and sat in her usual spot, but she did not order toast. She ordered coffee and held the cup with both hands and stared at the surface of it as though reading something written in the steam. Earl Newsom came in and did not open his newspaper. He sat at the counter and watched the door with the expression of a man who had fought in no wars but understood, in the way civilians sometimes do, that danger had arrived in his world and was not finished yet. Emmett arrived at 8:15. He walked through the door with the same deliberate pace, the same firm grip on his cane, the same quiet dignity that had defined him for as long as anyone in the room had known him. But the bruise on his cheek was darker now, a deep purple black that spread from his cheekbone to his jaw, and the split on his lip had scabbed into a thin dark line that pulled when he spoke. He sat in his booth, and Colleen brought his coffee, and their exchange was the same as it had always been. "Morning, Mr. Hollis." "Morning, Colleen." But this time she did not walk away. She set the coffee down and slid into the booth across from him, something she rarely did during the morning rush. Emmett looked at her over the rim of his cup, and in his eyes she saw something she had not expected. Not fear, not pain, curiosity. The old man could read her the way he read the weather, and he could see that something in her had changed overnight. "I made calls last night," she said quietly. "Every shop on this block. Pearl, Arthur Sheehan, June Prescott, Vernon Burke, Martha Haddock. Every single one of them, Mr. Hollis. Cade Strickland has been squeezing them all. Some of them for months." Emmett set his cup down slowly. "How bad?" "Bad. Martha took out a loan against her house. Arthur's been pulling from his grandson's college fund. Vernon had a brick through his window for refusing to pay. And Pearl, she's been paying $1,000 a month out of a flower kiosk that barely clears $2,000 in a good season." The old man's jaw tightened. She watched the muscles work beneath the bruised skin, and she knew he was doing what he always did, holding the anger inside, pressing it down, keeping it contained, the way a soldier keeps a live round in the chamber, not because he wants to fire it, but because he knows there may come a moment when he has to. "What's your plan?" he asked. "I'm going to talk to all of them. Face to face, I'm going to ask them to stand with me. If we all refuse to pay together, Cade can't come after all of us. There's strength in numbers." Emmett studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slow and certain. "You remind me of someone," he said. Colleen waited. Rainey, she had that same look when she'd made up her mind about something, like the whole world could push back and she'd just lean into it harder. Colleen felt the weight of that comparison settle on her shoulders like a mantle. She stood up, touched Emmett's hand briefly, and went back to work. That afternoon, Colleen closed the diner at 2 and began walking the block. She did not call ahead. She showed up at each door the way a neighbor should, the way people used to, before the world decided that phone calls and text messages were an acceptable substitute for standing in front of someone and looking them in the eye. Pearl Hoffman was her first stop. The flower kiosk was a small structure wedged between two larger buildings, barely more than a glorified shed, with a roll-up front window and a hand-painted sign that read Hoffman's Flowers in letters that had once been bright red and were now a soft, faded pink. Pearl was inside arranging carnations in a plastic bucket, her white hair pinned up in a loose bun, her glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She looked up when Colleen approached and immediately looked away the way people do when they know a conversation is coming that they are not ready for. Pearl, Colleen said, we need to talk. I already told you everything on the phone, Colleen. I don't know what else there is to say. There's plenty to say, and I think it's time we said it together instead of alone. Colleen told Pearl about the others, about Arthur and June and Vernon and Martha. She watched Pearl's expression change as the realization settled in the understanding that she was not the only one, that the shame she had been carrying was shared by every person on this street. He told me I was the only one, Pearl whispered. He said if I told anyone, he'd make sure no one rented to me again, that I'd lose the kiosk. He told all of you that. That's how it works, Pearl. He keeps you separate so you stay afraid. But you're not separated. You're neighbors, and neighbors look out for each other. Pearl was quiet for a long time. Then she took off her glasses and cleaned them on the hem of her apron, a gesture that Colleen recognized as the thing Pearl did when she was thinking hard about something. What are you asking me to do? Stop paying. Tell him no, together, all of us. And when he comes back angry, then we face him together too. Pearl put her glasses back on and looked at Colleen, and in her eyes there was something fragile and brave, at the same time like a candle flame in a draft. All right, she said, I'm in. Arthur Sheehan said yes before Colleen finished explaining the plan. He was standing at his pressing table, a steam iron in one hand, and he set it down with a deliberateness that made Colleen understand he had been waiting for someone to ask him to fight. He was a quiet man, Arthur, the kind who measured his words the same way he measured fabric, precisely and without waste. But when he spoke, his voice carried the iron certainty of a man who had spent his life making things that held together. I was in the Navy, he said, 40 years ago. I've been taking orders from worse men than Cade Strickland, and I've been ignoring most of them. Count me in. June Prescott was harder. She sat behind the counter of her bookshop, surrounded by towers of paperbacks that leaned against each other like tired old friends, and she listened to Colleen with her hands folded in her lap and her lips pressed into a thin line. My daughter wants me to close the shop and move to Portland, June said. If she finds out about this, she'll use it as proof that I can't take care of myself. You've been taking care of yourself for 68 years, June. You don't need your daughter's permission to keep doing it. June looked at her. You sound like you've had this argument before. I've had every argument before. I've run a business alone for 6 years. People have been telling me to sell the diner and retire since the day Frank died. I'm still here, and you're still here. And we're still here because we chose to be, not because we didn't have other options. June unfolded her hands. She picked up a book from the counter, something she did when she was nervous, turning it over and over in her fingers like a talisman. How many of us are there, she asked. With you 6, enough to matter. June set the book down. Then 7, she said. If Martha joins, I join. She shouldn't have to do this alone. Martha Haddock was already crying when Colleen walked into the bakery. The smell of fresh bread filled the small space, warm and golden, and Martha stood behind the counter, with flour on her hands and tears tracking down her cheeks, and Colleen knew immediately that something had happened. He came back, Martha said, this morning. He said he knows I talked to someone. He said the price just went up, $1,500 a month starting now. Colleen felt the anger flare in her chest, hot and sharp. She breathed through it. She crossed the shop and stood in front of Martha and took the older woman's flour-dusted hands in her own. Martha, look at me. You are not alone in this. Do you hear me? You are not alone. She told Martha about Pearl, about Arthur, about June. She told her about the plan, and she watched the fear in Martha's eyes shift, not disappearing, not completely, but making room for something else, something that looked in certain light like hope. I'm 70 years old, Martha said. I learned to bake from my grandmother. She taught me that bread rises because you give it time and warmth. She said people are the same way. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of flour across her cheek. I'll rise, Colleen. Just give me time. Vernon Burke was the last. He met Colleen at his door, which he opened exactly 4 inches enough to see who was there, but not enough to let them in. He was a lean man with a face like weathered rope, all knots and hard lines, and his eyes had the flat, watchful quality of someone who had seen things that other people only read about in books. "I already know why you're here," he said through the gap. Pearl called. "Then you know what I'm asking." "I know. And I'll tell you what I told that punk when he came to my shop. I don't pay protection to anyone. I didn't pay it in Saigon, and I'm not paying it in Montana." "That's not what I'm asking, Vernon. I'm asking if you'll stand with us, together. Not just holding your own door shut, but standing with the rest of us when we hold ours open." Vernon was quiet. Then the door opened another 4 inches. "You've got nerve, Colleen. I'll give you that." "I've got neighbors. That's better than nerve." He almost smiled. Almost. "Tuesday night, your diner. I'll be there." By the end of that day, Colleen had 7 commitments. 7 people. 7 small business owners, all over 60, all of them scared, all of them angry, all of them ready to stand together for the first time since Cade Strickland had walked onto Maple Street and decided that old people were easy targets. That Tuesday night, they gathered in the Maple Street diner after hours. Colleen had pushed 4 tables together in the center of the dining room and set out coffee and pie because she understood that people think more clearly when they are fed and that courage comes easier when there is pie involved. She had baked the pie herself that afternoon, apple using the recipe Frank's mother had left her, the one written on a card so old the ink had faded to the color of tea. It was a small thing, the pie, but Colleen believed in small things. She believed that kindness lived in details, and that the difference between a meeting and a gathering was whether someone had bothered to set the table. Emmett sat at the head of the table not because anyone asked him to, but because no one questioned it. He was the oldest among them, the most tested, and his presence gave the room a gravity that kept the conversation from spinning into panic. The bruise on his face was turning yellow at the edges, now healing in the slow way that old bodies heal, taking their time. Not because they are weak, but because they have learned that rushing leads to mistakes. Pearl sat to his right, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, her white hair catching the light from the overhead lamp. Arthur sat across from her, his back straight, his expression the same one he wore when measuring a difficult cut of fabric, focused and precise. Vernon had taken the seat nearest the door, which Colleen suspected was not accidental. June sat between Pearl and Martha, the 3 women forming a small cluster of solidarity that reminded Colleen of the way birds perch together on a wire close enough to feel each other's warmth. Colleen laid out what she knew: the amounts, the threats, the pattern. She explained that Cade Strickland was running a systematic operation targeting vulnerable business owners, and that his power depended entirely on keeping them isolated and afraid. "If one of us says no, he punishes that one person," she said. "But if all of us say no at the same time, he has a problem. He can't burn down every shop on the block. He can't threaten all of us at once. His whole game only works if we're scared and separated. So we stop being scared and we stop being separated." The room was quiet. Pearl gripped her coffee cup. Arthur sat with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. June turned a sugar packet over and over between her fingers. Vernon leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. Martha dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. Then Emmett spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried the way a church bell carries across a valley, not because it is loud, but because it speaks into a silence that is waiting to be filled. "I was 17 years old when they shipped me to Korea," he said. "I didn't know what I was walking into. None of us did. But I learned something over there that I've carried every day since. The enemy doesn't need to beat you. He just needs you to believe he already has." He looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "Don't let this man convince you that you've already lost. You haven't. You're sitting here. That means you're still in the fight." The meeting lasted 2 hours. By the end of it, they had a plan. Starting that week, every business on the block would refuse to pay. They would document everything, every visit from Cade, every threat, every act of intimidation. Colleen would coordinate. She would keep the records. And if Cade escalated, they would go to the authorities together, not as one frightened voice, but as a chorus. They shook hands as they left, and there was something in those handshakes that had not been there before. A firmness, a belonging, the sense that they were no longer 7 separate people carrying 7 separate burdens, but something larger, something that had edges and weight and the stubborn refusal to break. Colleen stood at the door and watched them go one by one into the dark October night. Emmett was the last to leave. He paused at the threshold and turned to her. "You did a good thing tonight, Colleen. We'll see if it holds. It'll hold because you'll hold it." He touched the brim of an imaginary hat, a gesture from a time when men still did such things, and walked out into the cold. 3 days passed, then Cade Strickland came back. He did not come to the diner first. He came to Pearl's flower kiosk at 7 in the morning before the block was awake, and he did what men like him always do when they feel their control slipping. He made an example. Colleen heard about it from Hank Purcell, the hardware store owner, who had been opening his shop when he saw the smoke. By the time she ran the 3 blocks to Pearl's kiosk, the fire department was already there, and Pearl was standing on the sidewalk in her bathrobe and slippers watching 20 years of her life burn. The kiosk was destroyed. Not completely, the frame still stood, blackened and skeletal, against the morning sky, but the flowers were gone, every last one of them. The carnations Pearl arranged every morning with the patience of a woman who believed that beauty was a form of resistance. The roses she kept in the refrigerated case for weddings and funerals, and the quiet anniversaries that people celebrated not because they had to, but because they wanted to remember what love looked like. The hand-painted sign that had hung above the kiosk since the day Pearl opened it, the sign her late husband had painted for her as a surprise on their 30th anniversary, the letters careful and slightly uneven because he was a plumber and not an artist, but he had wanted to give her something made by his own hands. All of it was gone, reduced to ash, and the acrid smell of burned wood and scorched petals that hung in the air like a funeral. Pearl did not cry. She stood there with her arms crossed over her chest and her jaw set and her eyes dry, and she watched the firefighters spray water onto the smoldering remains with the expression of a woman who had just been given a reason to be angry that was bigger than her fear. "He did this," Pearl said. It was not a question. Colleen put her arm around Pearl's shoulders and held her. "Yes, because I stopped paying. Because we all stopped paying. He's trying to scare us into going back." Pearl turned and looked at Colleen, and in her eyes there was something that Colleen recognized because she had felt it herself, that cold, slow, deep anger that does not explode but endures. "It didn't work," Pearl said. "But it did work on some of them." By that afternoon, 2 of the 7 had broken. June Prescott called Colleen in tears, saying she had found a dead rat nailed to the door of her bookshop with a note that read, "Pay up, she was done. She could not do this. Her daughter was right. She should sell the shop and move to Portland and forget Maple Street ever existed." And Martha Haddock did not call at all. She simply closed the bakery. The lights went off at noon, the door was locked, and when Colleen knocked that evening, no one answered. Through the window she could see the baking racks bare and cold, and the counter where Martha had rolled dough every morning for 30 years, empty and dark. 5 became 3. Colleen, Emmett, Pearl, Arthur, and Vernon. 2 gone in a single day. The coalition she had built with handshakes and pee in the belief that people would stand firm when it mattered had cracked, and Colleen could feel the fractures spreading like ice on a pond in spring, invisible from the surface, but weakening everything beneath. She did not blame June. She did not blame Martha. She understood in the way that only someone who has carried fear in her own body can understand that there is a difference between cowardice and self-preservation, and that the line between them is drawn by circumstances that no one else has the right to judge. June had a daughter who loved her and a life in Portland that was waiting for her, and choosing safety was not the same as choosing surrender. Martha had a house with a mortgage and a bakery that was her grandmother's legacy, and sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is admit that the cost of fighting has exceeded what they can afford to pay. But understanding did not make it hurt less. And as the evening settled over Maple Street like a cold blanket, Colleen felt the loneliness of leadership in a way she had never felt it before, the terrible clarity of standing at the front of a line and realizing that the line behind you is shorter than it was yesterday. That night, Colleen sat in the back office of the diner and stared at the wall, and for the first time since this had begun, she felt the weight of it pressing down on her with a force that made it hard to breathe. She had asked these people to fight. She had stood in their shops and their kitchens and looked them in the eye and told them they were not alone. And now Pearl's kiosk was ashes, and June was leaving, and Martha had locked her door, and the silence of the block was heavier than it had ever been. She thought of Emmett's words. The hardest part of any fight isn't the enemy in front of you. It's the moment when the people beside you start to walk away. This was that moment. She picked up the phone and called Emmett. It was late past 9 and she knew he went to bed early, but he answered on the second ring as though he had been expecting the call. June and Martha are out, she said. Pearl's kiosk is gone. Silence on the line. Then Emmett's voice steady as bedrock. And you, I'm still here. Then it's not over. She told him about the doubt creeping in, about the guilt of having led people into a fight that was costing them more than she had promised. Emmett listened the way he always listened, completely without interruption, letting her words find their own gravity. When she finished, he said, in Korea there was a hill, Hill 281. We were ordered to hold it, 37 of us at the start. By the second night there were 11. The others weren't cowards. They were just men who had reached the limit of what they could endure. There's no shame in that. But the 11 who stayed, we held that hill. Not because we were braver, because we decided that the hill mattered more than our fear. I'm not a soldier, Mr. Hollis. No, you're something harder. You're a civilian who chose to fight anyway. Soldiers have orders. You have nothing but your own conscience. That takes more courage than anything I ever did in uniform. Colleen closed her eyes. She pressed the phone against her ear and let his words settle into her. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. Just hold the hill. The next morning, Colleen changed her strategy. She understood now that Cade Strickland could not be beaten by solidarity alone, because solidarity crumbles when people are afraid, and fear was the one currency Cade had in unlimited supply. She needed something stronger. She needed evidence. Not the ledger in her notebook, not the whispered confessions of frightened shopkeepers, but hard, undeniable proof that could not be scared into silence. She went to the hardware store and bought a small digital camera, the kind designed for home security, no bigger than a matchbox. That night after closing, she mounted it above the front door of the diner, angled to capture the sidewalk and the entrance. She tested it 3 times, reviewing the footage on her laptop in the back office, until she was satisfied with the angle and the clarity. Then she went to see Vernon Burke. Vernon listened to her plan without expression. When she finished, he walked to the back of his shop and returned with a shoebox. Inside were 4 more cameras, small and wireless, the kind that could be hidden in a flower pot or behind a stack of books. I bought these after the brick, he said. Never installed them. Figured it was too late. It's not too late. Can you help me set them up? Vernon looked at her for a long time, his weathered face giving away nothing. Then he reached for his jacket. Show me where. Over the next 2 nights, Colleen and Vernon installed cameras at 5 locations along Maple Street. The diner, Vernon's shop, the remains of Pearl's kiosk, Arthur's tailor shop, and the bakery where Martha had locked the door but had not yet surrendered the keys to the landlord. They worked after midnight, moving through the block in the darkness, Vernon's military training making him nearly invisible as he positioned cameras in places where no one would think to look. Colleen also began keeping a detailed log. Every time Cade or his men appeared on the block, she wrote down the date, the time, the location, and exactly what was said or done. She asked Arthur and Pearl and Vernon to do the same. She bought a fireproof lockbox from the hardware store and kept copies of everything inside it stored in the basement of the diner beneath a shelf of canned tomatoes. And then she took one more step. One that Emmett had made possible. Emmett had served in Korea with a man named Douglas Whitmore. Doug had come home from the war and put himself through law school on the GI Bill, and he had spent 30 years as a prosecutor before retiring to a small ranch outside of Billings. He was 79 years old, sharp as a tack, and bored out of his mind. When Emmett called him and explained the situation, Doug Whitmore drove to Ridgewood the next day. He sat in the diner's back office with Colleen for 3 hours, reviewing the notebook, the camera footage, the log entries. When he was finished, he leaned back in his chair and removed his reading glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. You've got enough here to interest the state attorney general's office, he said. This isn't a small-time shakedown. This is organized extortion targeting elderly business owners. That's a hate crime enhancement in Montana, depending on how the prosecutor wants to frame it. You file this right, and Mr. Strickland won't just be facing local charges. He'll be looking at state-level prosecution. How long would that take? Colleen asked. Weeks, maybe months to build a full case. But the filing alone would put pressure on him. And if you've got multiple victims willing to make statements, that's a pattern. Patterns are what prosecutors love. Colleen nodded. She did not have months. She had days. Cade's new deadline was approaching and she knew he would escalate again. But the cameras were running, the evidence was building, and for the first time since this began, she had something that Cade Strickland did not know about. She had a paper trail. And paper trails do not burn as easily as flower kiosks. That evening, after Doug Whitmore left, Colleen sat alone in the diner. The sun had set and the streetlights outside cast long, amber shadows through the windows. She was tired in a way that sleep would not fix, the kind of tired that lives in the muscles and the bones and the spaces behind the eyes where worry takes root. She thought about what she had built over the past week. A coalition that had already lost 2 members. A network of cameras that might or might not capture anything useful. A legal strategy that would take longer than she had. And a ledger of crimes committed against people who had done nothing wrong except be old and trusting in a world that punished both. Was it enough? She did not know. But she knew it was more than nothing, and more than nothing was the difference between surrender and survival. Then her phone rang. It was not a number she recognized. She answered it with the caution of a woman who had learned to be careful about who she spoke to after dark. Colleen Mercer. The voice was low and gruff, the kind of voice shaped by years of shouting over engine noise and wind. This is she. My name is Briggs. Well, that's what they call me. I got your number from a mutual friend. I ride with the Ridgemont chapter of the Hells Angels. I'm calling about Rowan Hollis. Colleen's hand tightened on the phone. What about him? He hasn't been right since you called. He won't talk about it, but he hasn't slept, and he's been staring at that photograph on his wall like he's trying to burn a hole through it. The one of his old man in the uniform. I've seen Rowan face down things that would make most men run. I've seen him ride through storms and stand in rooms where the air itself was dangerous. But I have never, not once in 20 years, seen him look the way he looks right now. How does he look? Like a man standing at the edge of something. Like he knows he has to jump but can't remember how. Colleen closed her eyes. She could see it. She could see a man she had never met sitting in a garage somewhere holding a phone that he had hung up on, wishing he hadn't. She could see his hands calloused and scarred from years of gripping handlebars and doing whatever it was that men in motorcycle clubs did when the world was not watching. She could see the photograph on the wall, the young soldier with hope in his eyes, and she could imagine what it must be like to look at that photograph every day and try to reconcile the man in the picture with the silence on the other end of a phone line that had been dead for 22 years. I didn't call to ask him to come back, Colleen said. I called because his mother asked me to. I know, but here's the thing. Rowan is the toughest man I know. He's led this chapter through things I can't even talk about on the phone. But ever since your call, he's been carrying something he can't ride away from. And I've known him long enough to know what that looks like. What does it look like? It looks like a man who needs to go home. Colleen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, his father is in trouble. The whole block is in trouble, but I'm handling it. I didn't call Rowan for help. Maybe not, but maybe he needs to help anyway. Not for you, for himself. The call ended. Colleen sat in the dark diner and held the phone against her chest and breathed. She had not asked for cavalry. She had not wanted it. This was her fight and she would see it through on her own terms. But Rainey's promise was alive in the world, now moving through phone lines and across highways, and Colleen could not control where it went. The next 2 days passed in a state of tense waiting. Colleen opened the diner every morning. Emmett came at 8:15. The cameras recorded. The log grew. Doug Whitmore filed preliminary documents with the state attorney general's office and told Colleen it would be at least 2 weeks before anything moved through the system. 2 weeks was too long. Colleen knew it in her gut the way she knew when a storm was coming before the clouds appeared. Cade would not wait 2 weeks. He had tasted defiance, and it had made him angry, and angry men do not operate on the timelines of bureaucracies. Then on Thursday night, Emmett collapsed. Colleen was closing up. It was 7:30 and the diner was empty, except for Emmett, who had stayed later than usual because the walk home seemed longer in the cold and the dark. He was sitting in his booth, his coffee long finished, his hands folded on the table, when his face went slack and his body listed sideways like a ship taking on water. One hand gripped the edge of the table, the other pressed against his chest, and then he slid out of the booth and onto the floor, and the sound his body made when it hit the linoleum was the worst sound Colleen had ever heard. She was beside him in seconds. She dropped to her knees and cradled his head in her hands, and his face was gray, the color of old newspaper, and his breathing was shallow and rapid and frightening. Mr. Hollis, Emmett, stay with me. Do you hear me? Stay with me. His eyes opened unfocused, searching. Colleen, I'm here. I'm right here. Don't move. She called the ambulance with one hand while holding his head with the other. The paramedics arrived in 8 minutes, which felt like 8 hours. They loaded Emmett onto a stretcher, and Colleen rode in the back of the ambulance, holding his hand, watching the monitors blink and beep, watching the paramedics work with the calm efficiency of people who do this every day and still somehow care every time. At the hospital, the doctor told her it was his heart. Not a heart attack, not yet, but a warning. A serious one. His blood pressure was dangerously high, his rhythm irregular. He needed rest. He needed medication. He needed to avoid stress. Colleen almost laughed at that last one. Avoid stress. The man had been slapped across the face by a thug, had watched his neighbors terrorized, had spent 22 years carrying the weight of a son who thought his father didn't love him. He had survived Korea and buried his wife and written letters to a ghost and woken up every morning in an empty house and walked to a diner where he pretended that coffee and routine were enough to hold a life together. Avoid stress was not a medical recommendation. It was a cruel joke. She sat beside his bed in the small hospital room watching him sleep. The machines hummed quietly around him, tracing green lines across black screens, each peak and valley, a small proof that his heart was still beating, still fighting, still stubborn enough to keep going even when the body around it was wearing thin. His face relaxed in sleep, looked older than she had ever seen it, and also somehow younger. Without the tension and the discipline and the careful mask he wore every day, she could see the boy he must have been once before Korea, before the silence, before the letters he never sent. She could see the 17-year-old who had lied about his age to serve his country, who had walked into a war he did not understand, and come out the other side with shrapnel in his leg and a quietness in his soul that he had mistaken for strength when it was really just the scar tissue of survival. She reached into the pocket of his flannel shirt, which was folded on the chair beside the bed. She did not know what she was looking for, but she found it anyway. A small leather-bound notebook, barely larger than a deck of cards, held together with a rubber band that was frayed at the edges. She opened it and began to read. The pages were filled with Emmett's handwriting, small and neat and slanting slightly to the right, the handwriting of a man who had learned to write in a one-room schoolhouse and had never changed his style. Each page was a letter. Each letter began the same way. Dear son, and each letter ended the same way. I am proud of you. I have always been proud of you, and I am sorry that I never learned how to say it in a way you could hear. Your father. There were hundreds of them, years and years of unsent letters, each one a window into the heart of a man who could face enemy fire without flinching, but could not pick up a telephone and call his own child. Some were short, just a few lines. Some went on for pages. Some described the weather, the garden, what Rainey had cooked for dinner. Some described the ache of waking up in a house that felt too empty, the way every holiday reminded him of the chair that should not have been vacant. Some simply said, I miss you, over and over, as though repetition might somehow carry the words across the distance that Emmett's pride had created and his fear had maintained. Colleen sat in the hospital room and read until her eyes blurred, and then she set the notebook down and pressed her hands against her face and breathed. She took out her phone. She opened the camera. She photographed every page carefully, one by one, making sure each letter was legible. It took her an hour. When she was done, she held the phone in her hands and stared at the screen, and she made a decision that she knew was not hers to make, but that she was going to make anyway because Rainey had asked her to, and because Emmett never would, and because some silences last so long that they become indistinguishable from death, and someone has to be the one to break them. She sent the photographs to Rowan Hollis. All of them. Every letter, every page. And beneath the last image, she typed a single message. These are the letters your father wrote to you, every week for 22 years. He never sent them because he was too proud and too afraid. But he never stopped writing. And there is something else you need to know. When you had the accident with Danny Ferris, your father paid every cent of the medical bills. His pension, his savings, everything your mother's family left him. He gave it all away to keep you out of prison. He never told you because he didn't want you to feel like you owed him. He wanted you to be free, even if it meant losing you. She pressed send. Then she put the phone down and she sat beside Emmett's sleeping body and she waited. The next morning, Friday, Colleen left the hospital at dawn. Emmett was stable, sleeping, the monitors showing rhythms that the nurses said were encouraging. She drove to the diner and opened it at 6 as always because the people on Maple Street needed to see those lights on. They needed to know that the diner was still there, that Colleen was still there, that the world had not surrendered overnight. Cade Strickland's deadline was today. Colleen stood behind the counter and made coffee and cracked eggs and cut bread for toast, and she moved through the motions of her morning the way a soldier moves through the motions of preparation before a battle. Not because the motions themselves will save you, but because they steady the hands and quiet the mind and remind you that you are still capable of doing ordinary things in extraordinary circumstances. By 9 o'clock, Emmett's booth was empty. It was the first morning in years that he had not been there at 8:15, and the absence was louder than any sound the diner had ever held. The regulars noticed. Earl Newsom looked at the empty booth and then at Colleen, and she shook her head once, a gesture that said, "He's alive, but nothing more." And Earl nodded and looked down at his coffee and did not ask another question. At 10 o'clock, Colleen went to the back office and checked the cameras. All 5 were recording. She reviewed the log, made sure the lockbox in the basement was secure, and called Doug Whitmore to confirm that the filing with the Attorney General's office was in process. "It's moving," Doug said. "Slowly, but it's moving. If Strickland does anything today, make sure the cameras catch it. The more documentation we have, the stronger the case." "He'll come today," Colleen said. "He gave me until Friday." "Then be ready. And Colleen, if it gets dangerous, you walk away. Evidence isn't worth your safety." "I built this diner with my husband's hands. I'm not walking away from it." She hung up and sat in the back office for a moment alone with the photograph of Frank and the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sounds of the diner beyond the door. She thought about Emmett in the hospital. She thought about Pearl and Arthur and Vernon, who had called that morning to say they were standing firm. She thought about June and Martha, who had walked away, and she did not blame them. She thought about Rowan Hollis somewhere out there reading letters from a father who loved him in the only language he knew. And she thought about Rainey. About that afternoon on the porch when the light was fading and Rainey's voice was thin but steady, and she had taken Colleen's hand and said, "Promise me." "I kept my promise, Rainey," Colleen whispered to the empty room. "Whatever happens now, I kept it." Then she stood up, straightened her apron, and walked back out to the counter. 48 hours. The cameras were rolling. The evidence was building. And somewhere on a highway cutting through the high plains of Montana, a convoy of 15 Harley-Davidsons was riding east toward Ridgewood, led by a man with gray in his beard and his father's letters burning in his phone, and a debt of 22 years that he was finally ready to pay. Colleen did not know they were coming. She stood behind her counter in her diner on her street, and she prepared to face whatever walked through that door next, alone if she had to, the way she always had. Friday came the way all reckonings come, quietly at first, then all at once. Colleen woke at 4:30 in the morning, an hour before her alarm, her body pulling her out of sleep the way it had on the morning Frank died, as though some part of her knew that today would demand everything she had and wanted to give her a head start. She lay in the dark for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom she had shared with Frank for 19 years, the ceiling he had replastered himself one summer weekend because the old plaster was cracking, and he did not want her waking up to the sight of something falling apart. That was Frank, always fixing things before they broke completely, always believing that the right amount of effort could hold anything together. She got up, she showered, she dressed in her usual clothes, a gray cotton shirt, dark jeans, her work boots, and the apron that she tied around her waist like armor. She drank a glass of water, standing at the kitchen sink, looking out the window at the street below, where the streetlights were still burning against the pre-dawn dark, and the leaves from the maples lay in wet piles along the curb like discarded pages from a book no one had finished reading. Then she drove to the diner. The drive was short, 3 blocks, but she drove it anyway because she had loaded the trunk of her car with copies of the evidence. The lockbox from the basement, the backup hard drive with the camera footage, the notebook with her handwritten log, and a sealed envelope addressed to Douglas Whitmore containing a letter that explained everything, every name, every date, every dollar in case something happened today that prevented her from explaining it herself. She was not being dramatic. She was being careful. There is a difference, and Colleen had learned it from Emmett, who had once told her that the men who survived Korea were not the bravest or the strongest. They were the ones who planned for the worst and then refused to let it happen. She arrived at the diner at 5:30. The block was dark and empty. She unlocked the front door, turned on the lights, and stood in the dining room for a moment looking at the space, the way you look at something you love when you are not sure you will see it again. The counter Frank had built, the booths with their faded red vinyl, the coffee maker that gurgled and hissed like a living thing, the photographs on the wall behind the register, Frank and Colleen on the day they opened, both of them grinning like fools standing in front of a building that was theirs and would be theirs for as long as they had the strength to hold it. She started the coffee. She fired up the grill. She set out the salt and pepper shakers. And then she did something she had not done in years. She sat down at the counter on Frank's stool, and she closed her eyes, and she allowed herself 1 minute of stillness before the day began. 1 minute to breathe. 1 minute to remember why she was doing this. 1 minute to feel the presence of everyone who had ever loved her, Frank Rainey, Emmett, even the neighbors who had walked away, because walking away did not mean they had stopped caring. It only meant they had reached the edge of what they could carry. The minute passed. Colleen opened her eyes. She stood up, and she went to work. By 7 o'clock, the diner was open and the first customers were trickling in. Earl Newsom took his usual seat at the counter. Hank Purcell came in from the hardware store stamping his boots against the cold. Dorothy Bledsoe arrived with her coat buttoned to the chin and ordered tea with the gravity of a woman who had decided that normalcy was a form of protest. Emmett's booth was empty. Colleen had called the hospital at 6. The nurse told her Emmett had slept through the night, that his vitals were stable, that he was awake, and asking for coffee, which they were not going to give him, and asking to leave, which they were not going to allow. The nurse said he was stubborn. Colleen said she knew. At 8:15, she looked at the empty booth and felt a hollow ache in her chest, the specific pain of seeing a space where someone should be and knowing they are not there because the world has been unkind to them. She poured a cup of black coffee anyway, walked it to the corner booth, and set it down on the table where Emmett always sat. She did not know why she did it. It was not rational. But it felt necessary, a way of saying that his place was held, that his absence was noticed, that the rituals they had built together over years of mornings were not so easily erased. The morning passed, 9 o'clock, 9:30, 10. The diner hummed with its usual sounds, the clink of silverware, the murmur of conversation, the sizzle of the grill. But beneath the surface, the air was tight. Colleen could feel it the way you feel the pressure change before a thunderstorm, a heaviness that has no visible source but presses against the skin and makes the hair on your arms stand up. At 10:15, the door opened. Cade Strickland walked in. He was not alone. Behind him came 4 men, each of them cut from the same rough cloth, broad and hard-eyed, and dressed in the uniform of men who made their living through intimidation. Dark jackets, heavy boots, expressions that dared anyone to hold their gaze for more than a second. They spread out through the diner the way water spreads across a floor, filling every gap, blocking every exit, their presence turning the small room into something that felt like a cage. The customers froze. Earl's hand stopped halfway to his coffee cup. Dorothy pressed herself into the corner of her booth. Hank stood up from his stool, took one look at the men by the door, and sat back down. Cade walked to the counter and placed both hands flat on the oak surface that Frank Mercer had sanded smooth with his own palms 25 years ago. He looked at Colleen, and in his eyes there was something that had not been there before. Not just arrogance, not just menace. There was anger now, real anger, the kind that comes from having your authority challenged by someone you consider beneath your notice. Friday, he said, 4,500, plus the interest I've been generous enough not to charge until now. Call it an even 6,000. And Colleen, before you say whatever brave little speech you've been rehearsing, let me tell you something. Pearl's kiosk was a warning. What comes next is not a warning. What comes next is a lesson, and lessons cost more than warnings. The diner was silent. Every eye in the room was on Colleen. She could feel the weight of those gazes, the fear in them, the hope in them, the desperate need for someone to do something, to say something, to be the person they were all too afraid to be. Colleen did not step back. She did not look away. She reached beneath the counter, and for a moment, every man in the room tensed, because men like Cade Strickland live in a world where reaching for something hidden means reaching for a weapon. But what Colleen pulled out was not a weapon. It was a folder. manila thick held together with a rubber band. She set it on the counter between her hands and Cade's hands, and she looked him in the eye, and her voice when she spoke was the steadiest it had ever been. This is a copy of a filing made yesterday with the Montana State Attorney General's office. It contains documentation of your extortion operation on Maple Street. Dates, amounts, names of victims, and signed statements from multiple business owners. It also contains camera footage from 5 locations on this block, showing you and your associates engaged in acts of intimidation, property destruction, and verbal threats against elderly residents. She paused, let the words settle. There are 4 copies of this file. One is with the Attorney General. One is with a retired prosecutor named Douglas Whitmore. One is in a safe deposit box at the First National Bank on Grant Street, and one is right here in front of you. She pushed the folder toward him just slightly, the way you might push a chess piece forward on a board. You can have this one. Consider it a courtesy, so you know exactly what they have on you. The room had gone so quiet that Colleen could hear the coffee maker dripping behind her each drop, hitting the glass carafe with the precision of a metronome. Cade stared at the folder. His jaw worked. His hands, still flat on the counter, curled slowly into fists. You think a piece of paper is going to stop me? His voice was low, but it had lost the smooth control it usually carried. There was gravel in it now, the sound of a man who was feeling for the first time in a long time the ground shift beneath his feet. It's not a piece of paper, Colleen said. It's a paper trail. And paper trails don't burn as easily as flower kiosks. Something flashed in Cade's eyes. Not fear, not yet, but the precursor to fear, the recognition that the situation had changed in a way he had not anticipated and could not undo with volume or violence. He had come here expecting a frightened woman behind a counter. He had found something else entirely. He opened his mouth to speak, and that was when the sound began. It started low, a distant rumble that could have been thunder if the sky had not been clear. But it grew steadily, relentlessly, the way an avalanche grows, a deep mechanical roar that shook the windows of the diner and vibrated through the floor and up through the legs of every stool and chair and table in the room. It was a sound that anyone who had ever lived near a highway or a rally or a biker bar would recognize instantly. Engines, dozens of them. Harley-Davidsons, their exhaust notes layered on top of each other in a chorus of controlled fury that filled the street outside like a living thing. Every head in the diner turned toward the windows. Through the glass, they could see them coming down Maple Street in a formation as tight and deliberate as a military convoy. 15 motorcycles, chrome and black, their riders sitting upright in the saddles with the posture of men who had been riding together for so long that they moved as a single organism. The morning light caught on their handlebars, in the studs of their leather vests, in the polished surfaces of their helmets, and the whole procession gleamed like something forged in a furnace and set loose upon the world. They pulled up in front of the diner and cut their engines simultaneously, the sudden silence as loud as the roar that had preceded it. For a moment, nothing moved. The riders sat on their ox, their boots planted on the asphalt, their faces unreadable behind dark glasses and weathered expressions. The insignia on their vests was visible, even through the diner windows, the winged skull, the arched letters, the name that had been synonymous with a certain kind of American mythology for over half a century. Hellsangels. The door of the diner opened and a man walked in. He was tall, taller than Cade Strickland by 2 inches, though he carried his height with a looseness that made it seem like even more. His beard was thick and streaked with gray, and it gave him the appearance of a man who had stopped caring about appearances a long time ago and had paradoxically become more imposing because of it. His arms were heavy with muscle and dark with ink tattoos that wound from his wrists to his shoulders in patterns that told stories only other riders would understand. His leather vest bore the patches of a chapter president, and his boots hit the diner's linoleum floor with the authority of a man who was accustomed to walking into rooms and changing the temperature. But it was his eyes that Colleen noticed first. They were pale blue, almost gray, and they held a steadiness that she had seen before every morning at 8:15 in the corner booth of her diner. Rowan Hollis looked nothing like his father and everything like his father at the same time. He stopped just inside the door and stood there, his gaze moving slowly across the room. He took in the customers in their booths, the fear on their faces, the men by the door who were Cade's and who were now very still. He took in the counter, the coffee maker, the photographs on the wall, and then his gaze found the corner booth, the empty one, the one with a full cup of black coffee sitting on the table untouched, waiting for a man who was not there. Something crossed his face. It was fast and it was private, an emotion that he buried before it could fully surface, the way a man presses a wound closed with his hand to stop the bleeding. He looked away from the booth. He looked at Colleen. And Colleen, who had never met this man, but had heard his name spoken by his mother in a hospital room and by his father in 100 unspoken ways, looked back at him and gave a single small nod. Rowan did not go to the counter. He did not address Cade. He walked slowly and deliberately to the corner booth, and he sat down. He sat in the seat across from where Emmett always sat, the seat that had been empty for as long as Colleen could remember. He placed his hands flat on the table the same way Emmett always did, and he looked at the cup of coffee across from him, and he was still. Behind him, the other bikers filed in. They did not rush. They did not shout. They entered the diner one by one, 14 men in leather and denim and boots, and they filled the room the way a tide fills a harbor, steadily and without negotiation. Some stood along the walls. Some sat at empty tables. One, a man in his 60s with a gray ponytail and a limp that spoke of old injuries, took the stool at the counter closest to Cade and folded his arms and said nothing. This was Briggs, and the look on his face made words unnecessary. Cade Strickland stood at the counter and watched his world contract. His 4 men, who had entered the diner with the confidence of predators, were now pressed against the wall near the door, their bravado evaporating in the presence of 15 men who wore their reputation like a second skin. The math had changed. The room had changed. Everything had changed. Rowan sat in the booth for a long moment. Then he stood. He walked to the counter with the unhurried pace of a man who had all the time in the world and intended to use exactly as much of it as he needed. He stopped 3 feet from Cade and looked at him, and the silence between them was the kind of silence that exists between a question and the answer that will change everything. "The man you hit," Rowan said. His voice was low and rough, the voice of a man who had spent decades speaking over the roar of engines and the noise of crowded rooms, a voice that did not need volume to carry authority. "The 81-year-old man you slapped in this diner. That man is my father." Cade's eyes widened slightly, just slightly, but it was enough. "He served this country before you were born. He survived things you can't imagine. He gave more of himself than anyone will ever know. And you walked into his place, into this woman's place, and you put your hand on him like he was nothing." Rowan took 1 step closer. Just one. The same way Emmett had on the day he was struck, that single step that carries more weight than 100 strides. "The woman behind that counter has already beaten you. She's got your whole operation on file with the state attorney general. She's got camera footage, witness statements, financial records. By next week, you'll have prosecutors going through your life with a fine-tooth comb. That's her work. She did that. Not me, not my brothers. Her." He let that sit, then he continued. "We're not here to fight you. Fighting you would be a waste of our time and an insult to the people in this room. We're here because family is here. And when family is threatened, we show up. That's what we do. It's the only thing we do that matters." Rowan glanced at Colleen, a look that lasted half a second, but carried the weight of everything she had done over the past week. The calls, the cameras, the evidence, the nights alone in the back office, the mornings she stood between Cade and Emmett and refused to move. That look said, "I see you. I see what you did." And it was enough. He turned back to Cade. "She's given you a way out. The file on that counter is your chance to understand what's coming and make a decision. You can walk away from Maple Street tonight and never come back, or you can wait for the state to come to you. Either way, you're done here." The diner was so still that Colleen could hear the heartbeat in her own ears. She watched Cade's face, watched the calculations moving behind his eyes, the anger wrestling with the mathematics of the situation. He was outnumbered. He was documented. He was standing in a room full of witnesses, surrounded by men whose reputation preceded them by decades, and the woman behind the counter had done what no amount of muscle could do. She had turned his shadow operation into a paper trail that led straight to a prosecutor's desk. Cade looked at the folder on the counter. He looked at Rowan. He looked at the bikers lining the walls. He looked at Colleen, and in her eyes he found nothing he could use. No fear, no doubt, no opening. He picked up the folder. He turned and walked toward the door. His four men parted to let him through, then followed their heads down, their swagger gone. The bell above the door jingled as they left, that same cheerful sound that had accompanied their entrance, but this time it rang like a period at the end of a sentence. The door closed. Through the window, Colleen watched Cade Strickland get into a black truck parked across the street. She watched his men climb in after him. She watched the truck pull away from the curb and drive down Maple Street, past the blackened remains of Pearl's kiosk, past the hardware store, and the tailor shop, and the bookshop, and the bakery, past all the places where ordinary people had been afraid for too long, and then it turned the corner and was gone. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then Earl Newsom exhaled loudly and said, "Well, I'll be damned," and the room broke open like a dam. People stood up. People spoke. Dorothy was crying, but they were different tears now, the kind that come from relief rather than fear. Hank Purcell reached across the counter and shook Colleen's hand with both of his, gripping it so hard she thought he might never let go. Gus came out of the kitchen and stood in the doorway with his spatula blinking rapidly, and then he went back to the grill, because that was what Gus did when he did not know what else to do. And within minutes, the smell of bacon filled the diner like a benediction. But Colleen was not watching any of this. She was watching Rowan. He had returned to the corner booth. He was sitting in the same seat across from the untouched cup of coffee, his hands flat on the table. His eyes were on the cup. And for all the authority he had just displayed, for all the steel in his voice and the power of his presence, he looked in that moment like a man who was very far from home and not sure he had the right to be here. Colleen walked to the booth. She slid in across from him the way she used to slide in across from Emmett. She did not speak immediately. She let the moment breathe. She let the noise of the diner settle around them like a familiar blanket. Then she reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out the small leather-bound notebook. Emmett's notebook, the one she had taken from his shirt pocket in the hospital room. She set it on the table between them, the rubber bands still holding it together, the pages still thick with 22 years of words that had never been spoken aloud. "These are the originals," she said. "I sent you photographs, but these are the real ones. Every letter he wrote to you, every week for 22 years. He kept them in his shirt pocket close to his heart every single day." Rowan stared at the notebook. His hands, which had been flat on the table, curled slowly, not into fists the way Cade's had, into something gentler, something that was trying to hold itself together. "He never sent them," Rowan said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "No, he never did. He was too proud and too afraid that you wouldn't read them." Rowan reached for the notebook. He picked it up the way a man picks up something fragile, something that might break if handled without care. He slipped off the rubber band and opened the first page, and Colleen watched his eyes move across his father's handwriting, the small, neat letters slanting to the right, the words that had been written at a kitchen table in an empty house by a man who could not say "I love you" out loud, but could write it 1,000 times in the dark. "Dear son." Rowan read. He turned pages slowly, one by one, and Colleen saw the muscles in his jaw tighten, and his throat work, and his eyes grow bright with something he was fighting very hard to keep from spilling over. She let him read. She did not rush him. She did not fill the silence with words of comfort or explanation. She simply sat across from him and was present the way Emmett had been present for her on the anniversary of Frank's death, not saying anything, just being there, because sometimes the most powerful thing one person can do for another is to witness their pain without trying to fix it. After several minutes, Rowan closed the notebook. He pressed it against his chest with both hands, the way you hold something precious that you are afraid of losing. His eyes were red, but no tears had fallen. He had his father's discipline in that regard, the ability to hold everything inside, to feel without breaking, to carry the weight without letting it show. "You told me in that message," he said, "about the money, about what he did for me, the medical bills, the pension. It's true, your mother told me before she died. Emmett paid every cent of Danny Ferris's medical bills. His pension, his savings, the inheritance from your mother's family. He gave it all to keep you out of prison. And he never told you because he didn't want you to feel like you owed him anything. He wanted you to be free." Rowan's hands tightened on the notebook. "I thought he threw me out because he was ashamed of me. He was never ashamed of you. He was afraid for you. And he didn't know how to be afraid for someone without it looking like disapproval. That was his failure. But it was a failure of language, Rowan, not of love. The words hung in the air between them. Rowan looked down at the notebook at his father's handwriting, visible through the worn leather cover, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then he looked up at Colleen, and his eyes, those pale blue eyes that were so much like Emmett's that it made her chest ache, held a question. Is he going to be all right? The doctors say he needs rest. His heart is weak, but it's still beating. He's at Ridgewood General Room 214. He doesn't know you're here. Rowan nodded slowly. He slid out of the booth and stood. He was a big man, broad and tall, and marked by decades of a life lived hard and fast, but standing there in the Maple Street diner, with his father's letters pressed against his chest, he looked like what he was. A son. A 55-year-old son who had missed 22 years of mornings and who was about to walk into a hospital room and see his father for the first time since the night he rode away on a Harley and thought he was leaving forever. He looked at Colleen. Thank you, he said, for calling me, for sending the letters, for keeping the promise you made to my mother. Your mother was my best friend, and your father is the closest thing I have to family. I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because it was right. Rowan held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked toward the door. Briggs stood up from his stool and followed without a word. Several of the other bikers moved to join them, but Rowan raised a hand, a single gesture that stopped them in their tracks. Stay here, he said. Watch the diner. Watch the block. I need to do this alone. He walked out. Through the window, Colleen watched him cross the sidewalk, swing a leg over his Harley, and ride east toward the hospital, the notebook tucked inside his vest, close to his heart, in the same place where Emmett had carried it every day for 22 years. Colleen stood behind the counter and watched until the sound of his engine faded into the distance. Then she turned back to the diner where the bikers had settled in, as though they had always been there, ordering coffee and eggs and talking quietly among themselves, their presence transforming the room from a place of fear into something that felt for the first time in weeks like a sanctuary. Pearl arrived at 11. She walked in and stopped short when she saw the leather vests and the tattoos and the row of Harleys parked outside. Arthur came in behind her, and then Vernon, who stood in the doorway for a full 10 seconds, surveying the room with his Vietnam-era vigilance before deciding it was safe and taking his usual seat. What did I miss? Pearl asked. Colleen smiled. It was the first real smile she had allowed herself in a week, and it felt foreign on her face, like a language she was relearning. Sit down, she said. I'll tell Q over coffee. That afternoon, Colleen received a call from Douglas Whitmore. The state attorney general's office had opened a formal investigation into Cade Strickland's operation. 2 of Cade's associates had already been picked up for questioning, and a detective from the State Bureau of Investigation wanted to visit Maple Street next week to review the camera footage and take statements. Colleen hung up the phone and sat in the back office for a moment, letting the news settle. It was not over. Investigations take time. Justice moves slowly, especially for people who have been patient their whole lives. But the machinery was turning, and it was turning in the right direction. And Colleen had learned a long time ago that you do not need to see the end of a road to know you are walking in the right direction. You just need to keep walking. At 4 o'clock, her phone buzzed. A text message from a number she now recognized. It was Rowan. The message was short. 5 words. He knew who I was. Colleen stared at the screen. She read the words again, and she understood. Emmett had seen his son walk into that hospital room. After 22 years, after hundreds of unread letters and thousands of unspoken words in a distance that had seemed as permanent as a mountain range, Emmett had opened his eyes, and Rowan had been there, and the old man had known him. Not the leather and the tattoos and the gray in his beard. The boy he had held as an infant. The boy he had raised and failed and loved with a ferocity he could never find the words for. He had known him the way a river knows the sea, because that is where it has always been flowing, even when the path seemed impossibly long. Colleen set the phone down. She pressed her hands against her face, and she let herself cry. Not for long, not dramatically, just a few quiet tears that she wiped away with the back of her hand before anyone could see. She cried for Emmett, who had waited 22 years for a knock on his door that he had given up hoping for. She cried for Rowan, who had spent half his life believing he was unloved, when the truth was that he had been loved so fiercely and so silently that it had looked from the outside like its opposite. and she cried for Rainey, who was not there to see it, but who had somehow, from beyond the grave, made it possible. Then she wiped her eyes, straightened her apron, and went back to work. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. They were better than that. They were ordinary. And ordinary was exactly what Maple Street needed. Emmett came home from the hospital on a Tuesday. Rowan drove him not on the Harley but in a borrowed truck because even Rowan understood that an 81-year-old man with a heart condition should not ride on the back of a motorcycle no matter how much the old man insisted he had done worse things in Korea. Colleen was waiting at the house on Birch Lane with a pot of soup and a bag of groceries, and when Emmett walked through the door leaning on his cane with one hand and on his son's arm with the other, she saw something in his face that she had not seen in the 3 years since Rainey died. Peace, not happiness exactly. Emmett was not a man who wore happiness easily, but peace, the deep and settled kind, the kind that comes from knowing that the thing you feared most, dying without your son, knowing you loved him, was no longer a possibility. The first morning Emmett returned to the diner, Colleen had his coffee ready at 8:15. He walked in slow but steady and sat in his booth and placed his hands flat on the table. Colleen set the coffee down in front of him. "Morning, Mr. Hollis." "Morning, Colleen." And then for the first time there was a second set of boots on the linoleum. Rowan walked in behind his father and slid into the seat across from him. He picked up the menu, studied it with exaggerated seriousness, and then set it down. "Coffee's still terrible here," he said. Emmett looked at his son across the table. The bruise on his cheek had faded to a faint yellow shadow, barely visible, now a ghost of the violence that had set all of this in motion. His eyes, those pale blue-gray eyes, held something that Colleen had never seen in them before. Not the quiet stoicism, not the controlled distance, something warmer. Something that trembled at the edges like a candle flame that has been sheltered from the wind for so long it has forgotten what it feels like to burn freely. "Then I guess you'll have to come back tomorrow and see if it's improved," Emmett said. Rowan nodded. "I guess I will." That was all. No speeches, no apologies, no tearful confessions or dramatic embraces. Just two men sitting across from each other in a diner booth drinking bad coffee, rebuilding a bridge, one plank at a time, with the patient, stubborn labor of people who have decided that the work is worth doing, even if it takes the rest of their lives. The investigation into Cade Strickland's operation moved forward. 3 of his associates were arrested within the month. Cade himself was indicted on 12 counts of extortion and 1 count of arson. The trial would not happen for months, but in Ridgewood, justice had already arrived in the form of an absence. Cade Strickland was gone from Maple Street, and the people who lived and worked there could feel the difference, the way you feel the difference when a fever breaks, a sudden lightness, a clarity, the sense that your body is your own again. Pearl did not rebuild the kiosk. She did something better. Colleen offered her a corner of the diner near the front window where the morning light came in, and Pearl set up a small table with buckets of flowers, and customers began buying bouquets with their breakfast, and the smell of fresh carnations mixed with the smell of coffee and bacon, and became one of the things that made the Maple Street Diner unlike any other place in the world. Martha reopened the bakery. She came back quietly without announcement, simply turning on the lights one morning and firing up the ovens and letting the smell of sourdough bread drift down the block like a white flag that meant not surrender, but return. The first person through her door that morning was Vernon Burke, who bought a loaf of bread and a blueberry muffin and said, "Glad you're back, Martha." And Martha said, "Glad to be back, Vernon." And that was all either of them needed. June did not come back. She sold the bookshop and moved to Portland to be near her daughter. And Colleen understood and did not judge, and sent her a card with a photograph of the diner on the front and a message inside that said, "You are always welcome here." June wrote back a month later, a short note on lavender stationery. "Thank you for being brave enough for all of us." And every morning the ritual continued. 6 o'clock, Colleen opened the diner. 7, the regulars arrived. 8:15, Emmett walked in, and behind him, Rowan. They sat in the corner booth, the father and the son, and they drank coffee that both of them agreed was terrible, and they talked. Not about the 22 years they had lost. Not about the argument or the accident or the money. They talked about the weather. They talked about the news. They talked about the food which Rowan always complained about and always finished. They talked the way men talk when they are rebuilding something that was broken, carefully, slowly, leaving space for silence when the words ran out, because silence between people who love each other is not emptiness. It is trust. Sometimes the other bikers came. They would pull up on their Harleys, the engines rumbling down Maple Street like a greeting, and they would file into the diner and order breakfast and treat Emmett with a reverence that made the old man uncomfortable and secretly pleased. Briggs always sat at the counter, always ordered black coffee, and always left a $20 tip that Colleen tried to refuse, and Briggs pretended not to hear. One morning, about 2 months after everything had happened, Colleen was wiping down the counter when she looked up and noticed something on the wall behind the register. Someone had hung a new photograph next to the one of Frank and Colleen on the opening day. It was a picture of Emmett in his military uniform, young and serious, and standing in front of the house on Birch Lane with Rainey's roses blooming behind him. Colleen did not know who had put it there. She looked at Rowan, who was sitting in the booth with his father, and Rowan looked back at her with an expression that gave away nothing and everything at the same time. She left the photograph where it was. A week later, she added one more. A picture that Briggs had taken on his phone and printed at the drugstore of the row of Harleys parked outside the diner on that Friday morning, chrome catching the light, the riders visible through the window, the Maple Street diner sign hanging above it all like a banner over a place that had been fought for and held. 3 photographs on the wall, a young couple on opening day, a young soldier in front of a garden, a row of motorcycles in the morning sun, past, present, and the bridge between them. On a cold November evening, after the last customer had left and the dishes were done and the grill was off, Colleen stood alone in the diner. The lights were low. The street outside was quiet. She walked to the corner booth and sat down, not in Emmett's seat and not in Rowan's, but on the edge the way a visitor sits, and she looked at the table where 2 men had found each other again after 22 years of silence. She thought about Frank, about the counter he had built with his hands, about the life they had imagined together, the children. They never had the future that had ended on a kitchen floor with a half-finished cup of coffee. She thought about Rainey, about the promise, about the afternoon on the porch when a dying woman had asked her to carry a message across a distance that seemed impossible. She thought about Emmett, who had written letters every week for 22 years and never once had the courage to mail them. And she thought about Rowan, who had ridden away from everything he knew and spent half his life believing a lie about his own father, and who was now sitting in a diner booth every morning, drinking bad coffee slowly and stubbornly, learning how to be a son again. She had not saved anyone. That was not what had happened. Emmett had saved himself by standing up. Rowan had saved himself by coming back. The neighbors had saved themselves by choosing in their own time and in their own way to stop being afraid. What Colleen had done was simpler and harder than saving. She had held the center. She had been the place where people came when they needed to be reminded that they were not alone. She had been the diner. She smiled at that thought. The diner, 25 years of eggs and coffee and conversations and grief and laughter and small daily kindnesses that added up over time to something that looked a lot like love. She stood up. She put the chairs on the tables. She turned off the coffee maker. She wiped down the counter one last time, running her hand along the oak surface the way she always did, feeling the smoothness that Frank had created, the wood that had been touched by 1,000 hands over 1,000 mornings. Then she turned off the lights, locked the door, and stepped out onto Maple Street. The night was cold and clear. The stars were sharp above the rooftops. The leaves had mostly fallen now, and the trees stood bare against the sky like hands reaching upward. Down the block, the bakery was dark, the tailor shop was dark, Vernon's watch repair was dark. But they were there. They were still standing. And in the morning, their lights would come on again, one by one, the way they always had. Colleen pulled her coat tighter and began walking home. Her boots sounded on the sidewalk steady and sure, the rhythm of a woman who had fought a battle she did not choose, and won it not with fists or fury, but with patience and courage, and the stubborn, unshakable belief that the people on her street deserved better than fear. Behind her, the Maple Street diner stood in the darkness, its windows reflecting the streetlights, the faded sign above the door just visible in the amber glow. Inside, on the wall behind the register, 3 photographs hung side by side, a young couple, a young soldier, a row of motorcycles, and tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock the lights would come on, and the coffee would brew, and at 8:15 an old man and his son would walk through the door and sit in the corner booth and begin again the way people do when they have been given a second chance and are wise enough to take it. And Colleen Mercer would be there to pour the coffee, the way she always had, the way she always would.